Say it, Emily. Tell everyone what you are. Madison Vale's voice sliced through the kitchen just as the silver spoon slipped from Emily Carter's trembling fingers and struck the stone floor with a sound too small for how loudly everyone laughed. Morning light had barely reached the frosted windows of Black Pine Pack House, yet the kitchen was already burning with heat, steam, and humiliation. Iron pans hissed over open flames. Fresh biscuits browned in the ovens. Bacon snapped in long black skillets. Coffee boiled strong enough to wake the dead. And in the center of it all stood Emily, 21 years old, pale hands dusted with flour, brown hair falling loose from its braid, her gray servant dress marked with ash near the hem. Around her, cooks, servants, and young warriors paused with plates in their hands as if breakfast had become entertainment. Madison stood before her in a cream wool dress that had never known smoke, never known dishwater, never known the sharp ache of scrubbing floors before sunrise. Her golden curls were pinned with pearl clips, her smile polished and cruel in the way only people admired by a crowd could afford to be. Beside her, Derek Hale leaned against the butcher's table, broad-shouldered and smug, turning an apple in his hand like he had all morning to watch Emily break. "Come on," he said, voice light with amusement. "It's not hard. 2 words. Wolfless girl." A few of the kitchen hands laughed again. Emily looked down at the spoon near her shoe. The reflection in its curved bowl was warped and tiny, a pale face, wide brown eyes, lips pressed together to keep the shaking inside. She could smell cinnamon, smoke, fried potatoes, and the sharp sweetness of spilled honey somewhere near the pantry. Beneath all of it was the heavier scent of wolves. Power, rank, confidence. The scents everyone in Black Pine Pack wore like crowns. Everyone except her. She had no wolf scent strong enough to command respect. No inner voice answering the moon. No shift waiting beneath her skin. At 18, when the others had run into the pine woods on 4 paws for the first time, Emily had stood alone behind the ceremony fire, listening to her own silence. Since then, the pack had stopped calling her Omega. Omega was weak, yes, but still wolf. Emily was something worse in their eyes. Empty. A mistake with human hands. A girl useful only because she could rise before dawn, knead dough for 50 mouths, and vanish before the important people entered the room. But this morning, vanishing had not been enough. Not with the Alpha King's breakfast being prepared. Not with every corner of the pack house polished for the arrival of Alexander Frost, the northern ruler whose name made grown wolves lower their voices. Emily had been told not to step into the main hall, not to look toward the royal guards, not to be seen. She had obeyed. She had kept her head down. She had folded napkins, warmed plates, and carried trays without spilling a drop. Then Madison had entered the kitchen with Derek at her side, and a smile that promised trouble. Now the entire room watched Emily, as if her shame were part of the morning service. Madison tilted her head. "Say it properly," she said. "I am Wolfless, and I know my place." Emily's throat tightened. The words pressed against her like cold hands. She could say the first part. They had made sure she heard it every day until it sounded almost like her name. Wolfless. Broken. Less than. But the second part caught somewhere deeper, in a place no one had managed to touch. Her place. Was it really here, beneath their laughter, beside a fallen spoon, with flour on her sleeves and heat burning behind her eyes? A faint sound rose from the hallway beyond the kitchen doors, almost swallowed by the crackle of the stoves. Metal against stone. Slow, measured steps. The laughter continued, but Emily heard it. For reasons she could not explain, her breath stopped. Madison stepped closer, lowering her voice into something sweeter and sharper. "Don't make us wait, Emily. Important guests are hungry." Derek pushed off the table and reached down, picking up the fallen spoon between 2 fingers as if it were dirty. "Here," he said, holding it out but not close enough for her to take. "Even the spoon has more shine than you." More laughter scattered through the kitchen, quick and careless. Emily lifted her chin just enough to meet Madison's eyes. Her hands were still trembling, but her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I'm not ruining breakfast." The room went quiet for half a heartbeat. Madison's smile faded. Outside the kitchen doors, the footsteps stopped. Then the iron handle turned. The iron handle turned slowly, and every sound in the kitchen seemed to lose its courage. The laughter thinned first, then the scrape of pans, then the nervous clink of cups being set down too quickly. Emily stood with her chin lifted by an inch she had not planned to claim, staring at Madison Vale while the heat from the ovens pressed against her back. She did not know who was outside the door. A guard, perhaps. Alpha Robert Blackpine coming to inspect the meal. Maybe Luna Marissa, arriving to scold the servants for letting smoke cling to the curtains. Whoever it was, Madison clearly believed she still owned the room, because she turned with a bright smile already prepared, the kind she used when important people were watching. But the door did not open all the way. Not yet. It paused, leaving only a narrow line of cold air cutting through the warm kitchen, carrying the scent of snow, pine, and something ancient enough to make every wolf in the room lower their eyes without understanding why. Emily felt it move over her skin like winter sunlight. Clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. Derek's hand tightened around the silver spoon. His smirk faltered. Madison's smile flickered, then hardened as if she blamed Emily for the sudden shift. Back to work, Madison snapped at the kitchen staff, trying to stitch authority back into the air. The king's breakfast does not prepare itself. A few servants quickly turned away, but no one truly moved. They were listening to the silence behind the door. Emily should have stepped back. She should have lowered her gaze and apologized for speaking at all. That was how she survived most mornings. A little obedience, a little invisibility, a careful swallow of every cruel word until it sat like a stone in her chest. Yet something had changed when she said she was not ruining breakfast. Not much. Nothing anyone else could see. But inside her, beneath the familiar emptiness where a wolf should have lived, there had been a faint stirring, like a match struck in a dark room. Madison noticed the difference before Emily did. Her blue eyes narrowed. "You think one little sentence makes you brave?" she asked softly. Emily did not answer. The safest answer was always silence. Madison stepped closer, close enough that Emily could see the tiny pearl beads sewn into the collar of her dress, close enough to smell rose water beneath the sharper scent of irritation. "My father told you to stay in the back pantry when the royal party arrived. You were given one simple instruction, and somehow you still found a way to embarrass this pack." "I was working," Emily said. Her own voice surprised her again. Quiet, yes. Shaking, yes. But present. Derek gave a low laugh, though it sounded less sure than before. "Working? You mean hiding in flour where you belong?" He tossed the spoon onto the prep table. It slid, spun once, and came to rest beside a tray of biscuits. Emily looked at it, then at the long breakfast table beyond the kitchen arch, where platters were waiting to be carried into the great hall. There were eggs folded with herbs, potatoes crisped in butter, sausage links glazed with maple, bowls of berries, pitchers of cream, baskets of biscuits wrapped in white cloth. She had touched almost all of it. She had helped make the meal they would praise without ever knowing her name. That was the shape of her life, her hands everywhere, her face nowhere. For a moment, memory pulled her backward to the hour before dawn, when the kitchen had been dark except for the stove embers and old Nora Whitaker humming near the sink. Nora had placed a warm biscuit in Emily's palm and whispered, "Eat before they remember to deny you softness." Emily had smiled then, a small private thing. She had fed half of it to Tommy, the 12-year-old scullery boy who had burned his fingers lifting a kettle too heavy for him. She had wrapped his hand, cooled the skin, and told him he was not weak for hurting. Tommy had looked at her as if kindness were a language he had nearly forgotten. That had been the only good thing about the morning. Then Madison arrived. Now Madison's gaze dropped to Emily's sleeve, where a damp mark still showed from helping the boy. "Look at you," she said. "Always touching things you should not. Always pretending your hands can fix something." The words landed too close to the secret Emily barely admitted to herself, the strange warmth that sometimes rose in her palms when someone cried, the calm that came over frightened animals when she whispered near them. It was not a wolf. It was not power. At least, that was what she had been told. Before Emily could speak, the door opened another inch, and the cold scent deepened. Every wolf in the room went still. Madison finally turned fully toward it, annoyance giving way to uncertainty. Emily lowered her eyes on instinct, but not before she saw the edge of a black cloak beyond the threshold, dusted with melting snow. The black cloak beyond the threshold did not move, yet the entire kitchen seemed to bend around it. Emily kept her eyes down, staring at the pale flower on her knuckles, but she could feel every wolf around her changing. Shoulders lowered. Breathing slowed. Even Madison Vale, who had built her life on never stepping aside, went quiet for one fragile second. The scent of winter pine slipped deeper into the room, threading through coffee, maple, smoke, and hot bread until the kitchen no longer felt like the hidden belly of Black Pine Pack House. It felt like the edge of a northern forest at dawn, when snow covered every branch and even the wind waited for permission to speak. Then a man's voice came from the doorway, low and calm. "Is there a problem with the meal?" No one answered. Emily knew that voice without knowing how. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the kind of authority that made excuses seem childish before they were even spoken. Madison recovered first, because people like her were skilled at turning fear into performance. She dipped into a graceful curtsy, head lowered just enough to look respectful but not frightened. "Your Majesty," she said, and several servants gasped so softly they almost swallowed the sound. Emily's heart dropped. "Your Majesty." The words moved through her like cold water. Alpha King Alexander Frost was not in the Great Hall. He was not seated before silver plates and polished candles, waiting to be served by people chosen for their beauty, rank, and proper bloodlines. He was standing at the kitchen door, close enough to see the ash on Emily's skirt, the damp mark on her sleeve, the spoon Derek had used to mock her, and the way everyone had been arranged around her like judges around someone already condemned. Emily lowered her head further, wishing the floor would open into the cellar and take her with it. Alpha Robert had warned every servant that the king valued discipline. If Alexander Frost saw disorder before breakfast, someone would pay for it. In Blackpine, that someone was almost always Emily. Madison seemed to know it too. "There is no problem," she said quickly, her voice smooth as warmed honey. "Only a small kitchen delay." The servants were being corrected. The word corrected made Emily's palms curl against her dress. She did not look up. She told herself not to. But the silence after Madison spoke was so complete that Emily felt trapped inside it. Finally, boots crossed the threshold. One step, then another. Measured, unhurried, heavy enough that the stone floor seemed to remember each one. A few people moved back without being told. Derek's apple rolled from his hand and bumped softly against the table leg. Emily saw black boots stop several feet in front of her. Not polished for ceremony, but dusted with melted snow and road salt, as if the king had come straight from the cold northern trail and chosen the kitchen before the throne room. "Corrected for what?" Alexander asked. Madison's smile returned, thinner now. "Clumsiness, Your Majesty. Nothing more." The girl forgets herself sometimes. The girl. Not Emily. Never Emily when important ears were listening. Emily felt that familiar shrinking begin, the old instinct to make herself small enough to survive. But then Nora Whitaker made a tiny sound near the stove, not quite a cough, not quite a warning. Emily glanced sideways and saw the old cook gripping a towel in both hands, her lined face pale with worry. Tommy stood half-hidden behind a flour barrel, his bandaged fingers tucked against his chest. He was watching Emily with wide, frightened eyes. He thought this was his fault. That realization steadied something inside her. The strange warmth in her palms stirred again, faint but real, like a candle cupped against a storm. Alexander turned his head slightly. Emily could not see his face, only the shadow of him across the floor, tall and still. "Does clumsiness require an audience?" he asked. No one laughed this time. Madison's breath hitched, almost too softly to hear. Derek shifted his weight. "Your Majesty," he said, trying for confidence and landing closer to panic. It was only a joke. The king did not answer him. Instead, Alexander stepped closer, and Emily saw the edge of his cloak settle near the spilled honey, dark wool against gold. "A joke," he repeated, not as a question, but as if he were testing the word and finding it empty. Emily's throat tightened. She had heard that word her entire life. It was only a joke when they hid her shoes before winter chores. It was only a joke when they held outside her room on full moon nights. It was only a joke when Madison called her a quiet little human in front of visiting packs. The cruelty was always softened after it landed, wrapped in laughter so no one had to call it what it was. Alexander's voice came again, quieter now. "Look at me." Emily froze. For one terrible second, she thought he meant Madison. Then every gaze in the kitchen shifted toward her, and she understood. Her fingers tightened in her skirt. Slowly, against every lesson Blackpine had pressed into her bones, Emily Carter lifted her eyes to the Alpha King. Emily had imagined the Alpha King 100 different ways, because everyone in the Northern Territories had a story about Alexander Frost. Some said his eyes were pale as frozen lakes. Some said his presence could quiet a full council without a single raised word. Some said he was so cold that no one had ever seen him smile. None of those stories had prepared her for being seen by him. Not looked at. Seen. His face was sharper than any portrait carved into the pack hall, all hard lines softened only by the road weariness beneath his eyes. His hair was dark brown, nearly black in the kitchen light, brushed back from a brow that made every expression seem deliberate. He was taller than Derek by several inches, broad in the shoulders, dressed in black wool and leather with no crown, no jewels, nothing bright except the silver clasp at his throat shaped like a northern wolf. But it was his gaze that took the breath from Emily's lungs. Gray. Not warm gray. Not gentle gray. The kind of gray that belonged to storm clouds over snowfields, to rivers before they froze, to steel left under moonlight. And somehow, when those eyes found hers, they did not slide past her the way everyone else's did. They stopped. The kitchen held still around them. Emily felt flour drying on her fingers, heat rising from the ovens, the sting of old shame crawling up her neck. She wanted to apologize, though she did not know for what. For being in his way. For existing where she had been told not to exist. For making a powerful man look at a life Blackpine had worked so hard to hide. Your name? Alexander said. Emily swallowed. Her voice nearly failed. Emily Carter, Your Majesty. Madison made a small impatient sound. She is no one of importance. Just kitchen help. Alexander's eyes did not leave Emily. I asked her. For words. Quiet. Even. But Madison went pale beneath her perfect powder. Emily felt the whole room absorb the correction as if it had been spoken to each of them. I asked her. No one had defended the simple fact of Emily's voice before. Not publicly. Not in a room where Madison stood shining and Derek stood smirking, and every servant knew which side was safest. Emily did not know what to do with the feeling that rose inside her. It was too fragile to be hope, too warm to be fear. Alexander's gaze lowered to her sleeve. You are hurt. Emily glanced down. The burn on her wrist was not severe, only red from steam and hot water, the kind of kitchen injury she had learned to ignore. It is nothing. Nothing is what people call pain when they have been trained not to bother anyone with it, he said. The words struck something hidden inside her so precisely that her eyes stung. Nora turned away quickly near the stove, pretending to stir gravy. Tommy stared as if the king had just named the secret law of the kitchen. Madison stepped forward, her smile returning in pieces. Your Majesty is kind to notice, but truly, Emily is dramatic. She often exaggerates small discomforts to draw attention. Emily's stomach tightened. There it was. The familiar turning. If she was quiet, she was strange. If she spoke, she wanted attention. If she hurt, she was pretending. If she endured, they called it proof she was meant for it. Alexander finally looked at Madison. The change was small, but the room felt colder. Did I ask you? Madison opened her mouth, then closed it. Derek lowered his eyes to the floor. From the hall beyond the kitchen came the faint shuffle of more boots, royal guards waiting, perhaps hearing everything. Emily realized then that this was no longer a kitchen matter. This was a room full of witnesses. Madison seemed to realize it too, because her voice sharpened under its sweetness. Of course not, Your Majesty. I only wished to explain before misunderstanding grew. Emily has been troubled for years. No wolf, no proper scent, no place in rank. The pack has shown her patience. The word patience sounded clean. Too clean for what it carried. Emily remembered winter nights hauling firewood while others ran beneath the full moon. Remembered feast days when she was told to eat after everyone left. Remembered standing behind the ceremony fire at 18, waiting for a wolf that never came, while the pack's pity slowly turned to disgust. Alexander listened without expression. Then he looked back at Emily. Is that true? She knew the safe answer. Yes, Your Majesty. They have been patient. I am grateful. The words lined up inside her like tired servants waiting to be dismissed. But Tommy's bandaged hand flashed in the corner of her vision, and Nora's whisper from dawn returned to her. Eat before they remember to deny you softness. Emily drew one careful breath. They have given me work, she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. Not patience. The kitchen became so silent that the bubbling gravy sounded loud. Madison's eyes widened, not with shock, but offense, as if a chair had spoken. Derek whispered her name in warning. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She expected anger. She expected dismissal. She expected the Alpha King to turn coldly away now that he had witnessed enough of Blackpine's shame. Instead, Alexander Frost took one step closer, bent slightly, and picked up the fallen silver spoon from the table. He held it out to her, not like a test, not like a joke, but like something that belonged in her hand. Then let us begin with patience now, he said. Emily stared at the spoon in the Alpha King's hand as if it were something far more dangerous than silver. No one moved. The kitchen, so loud only moments ago, had become a room full of held breath and lowered eyes. Alexander Frost waited without impatience, his gloved palm steady, the spoon resting across it like a small offering. Emily had spent her life taking things from people who wanted her to remember her place. A bucket shoved into her arms. A stack of plates placed too high. A broom tossed at her feet. But this was different. He was not throwing the spoon back to her. He was returning it. The difference was so simple that it nearly broke her. Slowly, Emily reached out. Her fingers brushed the cool metal first, then the edge of his glove. A faint warmth moved through her palm, sudden and impossible, like sunlight passing beneath ice. She inhaled softly. Alexander's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition, as if he had felt it too. For one heartbeat, the kitchen disappeared. There was only the scent of snow and dark pine, the steady gray of his gaze, and the strange quiet in her chest where emptiness had lived for years. Then Madison's voice cut through it. Your Majesty, you must not trouble yourself with kitchen things. The spell cracked. Emily stepped back quickly, clutching the spoon so tightly that its edge pressed into her skin. Madison's cheeks were flushed now, her poise straining at the seams. She looked from Emily's hand to Alexander's face, and something sharp passed through her expression. Not fear. Calculation. Breakfast is ready for the Great Hall, Madison continued, brighter than before. My father will be waiting. The pack prepared a proper table for you. Alexander did not turn. I see a proper table here. Every eye shifted toward the long wooden work table in the middle of the kitchen, scarred by years of chopping, kneading, and heat. A dusting of flour covered one end. A bowl of berries sat beside a pan of biscuits. A crock of butter had begun to soften near the stove. It was not royal. It was not polished. It was the table where servants ate standing up when no one remembered to give them chairs. Madison laughed once, uncertainly. Here. Yes, Alexander said. Here. The words settled like a command. From the doorway, two royal guards entered and stood aside, their black uniforms marked with the silver wolf of the Northern Crown. Behind them, Alpha Robert Blackpine appeared, breathless and smiling too hard. He was a heavy-set man with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of confidence that depended on every room agreeing with him. The moment he saw Alexander standing beside Emily, his smile faltered. Your Majesty, he said, bowing deeply. Had I known you wished to inspect the kitchens, I would have arranged a formal welcome. That is why I did not tell you, Alexander replied. Emily felt Alpha Robert's gaze land on her like a weight. His expression did not change for the king, but she knew that look. Later, it said, you will answer for this later. Her stomach tightened. Alexander glanced at her, and somehow the room seemed to notice the fear she had tried to hide. His voice remained calm. Miss Carter prepared this meal? Alpha Robert hesitated. She assisted. Nora's hands tightened around the towel. Tommy looked at the floor. Madison smiled again, eager to repair the story. Many hands prepared it, Your Majesty. Emily only does simple tasks. Emily should have stayed silent. A lifetime of survival told her to let the lie pass. But the spoon in her hand felt heavy now, not with shame, but with proof. She had rolled the biscuits. She had stirred the gravy. She had sliced apples, brewed coffee, and stood over the stove until her cheeks burned. Her life had been reduced to simple tasks by people who depended on them. Alexander turned to her. What did you make? The question was so ordinary, so impossible. No one asked her that unless something had gone wrong. Emily looked at the table, then answered softly. The biscuits, Your Majesty. The potatoes. The apple butter. And the coffee? A pause. I helped with the eggs. Alexander nodded once. Then I will have what Miss Carter made. Madison went still. Alpha Robert's jaw tightened. Across the kitchen, Nora closed her eyes as if whispering thanks to the moon. Emily looked down at her flower-marked dress, her reddened wrist, the spoon trembling in her hand. For the first time that morning, the heat in her chest did not feel like humiliation. It felt like a door beginning to open. The order changed the kitchen more than any raised voice could have. Servants who had known exactly where to stand no longer knew whether to move closer or disappear. Nora recovered first, because kitchens belonged to people who understood heat better than fear. She wiped her hands on her apron, lifted a clean plate from the warming shelf, and set it at the long wooden table with quiet dignity. Tommy hurried to bring a fork and knife, his bandaged fingers careful around the silverware. Emily watched them as if from underwater, still holding the spoon Alexander had returned to her. The Alpha King removed his black gloves one finger at a time and placed them beside the plate. The gesture was simple, but every wolf in the room seemed to understand that he meant to stay. Alpha Robert Blackpine gave a strained laugh. Your Majesty, the Great Hall has been prepared with a fire, music, and proper seating. Surely you would be more comfortable there. Alexander looked at the scarred bench beside the work table. Comfort is rarely honest. No one knew what to say to that. Madison stood near the pantry door, her face smooth again, but Emily could see the tightness around her eyes. Madison was not finished. People like her did not surrender a room. They only changed the weapon in their hand. Emily, she said sweetly, serve His Majesty, since he has asked for your work. The words sounded helpful, but Emily heard the trap beneath them. If her hands shook, they would call her careless. If she spilled, they would call her unfit. If she hesitated, they would say she had embarrassed the pack in front of the Northern Crown. Emily reached for the plate of biscuits. The pan was warm through the towel. Her wrist ached from the earlier burn, and the red mark flared as she lifted the weight. She took one step toward the table, then another. The kitchen floor felt longer than it ever had, 20 feet of stone between shame and judgment. Alexander watched her approach, not with impatience, not with pity, but with a still attention that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe. She set the biscuits down without dropping them. A small victory. Tiny, almost invisible, but Nora's mouth softened with pride. Tommy smiled before remembering to hide it. Emily turned for the potatoes, then the apple butter, then the coffee. Each item reached the table whole. Each silence grew less cruel and more uncertain. When she poured the coffee, the dark stream trembled once, then steadied. Alexander accepted the cup with a nod. Thank you, Miss Carter. Miss Carter. Not girl. Not servant. Not mistake. Her name, given room to stand upright. Emily stepped back, but Madison moved at once, her voice bright enough to cut. You are generous, Your Majesty. Most would not encourage delusions. Emily has always wanted to seem special. Alpha Robert cleared his throat in warning, but Madison pressed on, careful to sound concerned instead of cruel. She is kind in her way, but kindness is not rank. She has no wolf, no scent, no place in a royal conversation. The old words returned, dressed in better manners. Emily felt the warmth in her palms flicker like a candle threatened by wind. Alexander spread apple butter over one of the biscuits and took a slow bite. The kitchen waited for a verdict as if the fate of the pack had been baked into the dough. He chewed, swallowed, and set the biscuit down. This is excellent. Nora's eyes shone. Tommy looked ready to burst. Emily forgot how to breathe. Madison's smile held, but only barely. A simple recipe, she said. Alexander looked at Emily. Simple things reveal careful hands. Then he turned his attention to Tommy. What happened to your fingers? The boy froze. Emily's stomach dropped. Tommy tucked his hand behind his back, but the bandage had already been seen. A kettle slipped, Your Majesty. Madison answered before he could. Kitchen children are clumsy. Alexander's gaze moved from Madison to Emily's damp sleeve, then to Tommy's hidden hand. Who wrapped it? Tommy looked at Emily, terrified of telling the truth and more terrified of lying to a king. Emily answered for him, softly. I did. Alexander leaned back, his expression unreadable. With permission? The question fell like a key into a lock. Madison opened her mouth, but this time Emily spoke first. No, Your Majesty. Her voice trembled, yet it did not break. No one gives permission for small mercy here. The room went utterly still. And deep inside Emily's silence, something answered. The answer that rose inside Emily was not a voice at first. It was warmth, low and trembling beneath her ribs, spreading outward as if some hidden ember had been waiting years for enough air. She stood beside the work table with her hands folded at her waist, aware of every stare in the kitchen, every held breath, every old rule cracking beneath the weight of what she had just said. No one gives permission for small mercy here. The words hung in the steam between them. Emily wished she could pull them back, hide them under flour sacks, bury them beneath the ash she swept from the stove each morning. But they were out now, and once spoken, truth had a terrible habit of standing taller than fear. Alpha Robert's face tightened. Emily is emotional, Your Majesty. She has always struggled to understand pack order. Madison nodded quickly, seizing the opening. Exactly. She mistakes discipline for cruelty because she has never had the instincts to belong properly. Derek looked relieved, as if the room had found familiar ground again. That is all this is, he added. A kitchen girl wanting attention. Emily looked at Tommy. The boy's eyes were wet, but he did not look away from her. Nora stood behind him like a wall made of aprons and iron patience. For the first time, Emily understood that her silence had never protected only herself. It had taught the gentle ones to be quiet too. Alexander Frost set down his coffee cup. The soft sound of porcelain on wood made every wolf in the room flinch more than thunder might have. Pack order, he said calmly, is not permission to erase the weak. Alpha Robert bowed his head, but his voice remained smooth. Of course not, Your Majesty. Blackpine values every member who contributes. Alexander's eyes moved over the kitchen, taking in the cracked hands of the servants, the tired faces, the careful distance everyone kept from Madison. Then you will not mind if I ask your people what they value. Madison's smile vanished. Alpha Robert went still. Emily felt the warmth inside her pulse once, bright and startling. Alexander looked to Nora. You. How long has Miss Carter worked in this kitchen? Nora straightened slowly, as if years of bending over ovens had not stolen an ounce of her pride. Since she was 14, Your Majesty. Emily's breath caught. No one had ever counted those years aloud. Does she work well? Better than most who call her useless, Nora said. The kitchen shivered with the danger of honesty. Madison inhaled sharply. Alpha Robert's eyes flashed warning, but Nora did not lower her chin. Alexander turned to Tommy. And you? Did she help you today? Tommy's small shoulders rose and fell. Yes, Your Majesty. His voice shook, then steadied when Emily looked at him. The kettle slipped because I lifted it wrong. Miss Emily cooled my hand and wrapped it. She said hurting did not make me weak. The warmth in Emily's chest climbed into her throat. She had said that because someone should have said it to her years ago. Alexander's gaze returned to her, and in it she saw no surprise, only confirmation. As if every answer in the room was fitting into a pattern he had already sensed. Madison stepped forward, desperation sharpening her manners. With respect, Your Majesty, kindness to servants does not change blood. She is still wolfless. The word struck the room like a dropped plate. Wolfless. There it was again, bare and ugly, stripped of polish. Emily braced herself for the familiar sting. But this time, the warmth inside her did not shrink. It rose. The air near the table shifted, so faintly that at first she thought it was steam from the coffee. Then the silver spoon in her hand grew warm. Tommy gasped. Nora whispered something under her breath. A pale glow, soft as moonlight through snow, gathered around Emily's fingers. Not bright, not frightening, gentle, alive. Emily stared at her own hand, frozen between terror and wonder. Madison stepped back. Derek's face lost all color. Alpha Robert whispered, Impossible. Alexander Frost stood so slowly that the bench barely made a sound beneath him. His gray eyes fixed on the light around Emily's hand, and for the first time since entering the kitchen, the cold mask of the Northern King shifted. Not into shock, not into fear, into recognition. Not wolfless, he said softly, and the words seemed to reach the hidden place inside her that had just opened its eyes. Not wolfless. The words did not make sense at first. Emily had heard the opposite so many times that her mind reached for the old insult out of habit, waiting for it to land, waiting for the room to laugh and make the world ordinary again. But no one laughed. The pale glow around her fingers brightened by a breath, soft and silver white, spilling over the spoon, tracing the lines of her palm, gentle as moonlight resting on fresh snow. It did not burn. It did not frighten her skin. It felt familiar in the way a forgotten lullaby feels familiar, as if some part of her had known this light long before she had known shame. Emily tried to close her fist, but the light slipped between her fingers. Madison backed into the pantry door, her perfect face emptied of confidence. "That is a trick," she whispered. "It has to be." Alpha Robert looked at Alexander with sudden urgency. "Your Majesty, whatever this is, we can contain it. The girl has always been unstable. We never imagined she would display anything in front of you. Contain it." Emily flinched at the word. The light flickered, and with it came a sharp ache beneath her ribs, not pain exactly, but pressure, like a door being pushed open from the other side. Alexander moved before anyone else could speak. He stepped between Emily and the room, not touching her, not crowding her, simply placing his tall frame where every accusing gaze had to pass through him first. "No one will contain her." His voice was quiet, but the command in it settled over the kitchen like snowfall over a battlefield, soft and absolute. One of the royal guards lowered his head. Nora pressed a hand to her mouth. Tommy smiled through tears he was trying very hard to hide. Emily stared at Alexander's back, at the black cloak dusted with melted snow, at the silver wolf clasp shining at his throat. All her life, people had stepped aside so others could reach her with mockery. No one had ever stepped in front of her, so the world had to stop. "Your Majesty," Madison said, forcing her voice into a trembling sweetness, "you do not understand. She cannot shift. She has no wolf. She never did. We watched her fail at the moon ceremony." Alexander turned his head just enough for Emily to see the hard line of his profile. A sleeping gift is not a failure. Emily's breath caught. The warmth in her chest pulsed again, answering him. Not with words, not exactly, but with an awareness that spread through her bones. She smelled pine needles under ice. She heard wind over distant mountains. She felt something vast and patient lifting its head in the silence she had mistaken for emptiness. Her knees weakened, and the spoon slipped from her hand, but Alexander caught it before it struck the floor. This time, when he returned it, his bare fingers brushed hers. The kitchen vanished for a heartbeat. Emily saw a flash of white forest, a full moon hanging low, and a great silver wolf standing at the edge of the trees with eyes like her own. She gasped and pulled back, but the glow did not fade. It bloomed across both her hands now, touching the reddened mark on her wrist. The sting eased, then disappeared completely. Tommy looked down at his bandaged hand. "Miss Emily," he whispered. "It feels better." The bandage had begun to glow too, faintly, as if her mercy had remembered where it had gone. Alpha Robert staggered back one step, not from danger, but from the terrible realization that he had hidden treasure in the ash pile and called it dirt. Madison shook her head again and again. "No, no, she is nothing." Alexander faced her fully then. "You will not use that word for her again." Madison lowered her eyes at last. The room followed. One by one, servants, warriors, even Alpha Robert bowed their heads. Not to Emily exactly, not yet, but to the truth standing beside her. Emily looked at her glowing hands, then at Alexander. "What am I?" she asked, barely louder than the crackle of the stove. For the first time, the Alpha King's cold expression softened. "Someone the moon hid carefully," he said. "And someone I was meant to find." Someone the moon hid carefully. Someone I was meant to find. Emily could not move after those words. They settled around her more gently than praise, more frighteningly than any insult, because they asked her to imagine a life Blackpine had never allowed her to picture. A life where her silence had not been emptiness. A life where the strange warmth in her hands was not a flaw to hide beneath dishwater and flour. The glow slowly softened until it rested beneath her skin like banked candlelight, still there, still alive. Around the kitchen, no one seemed to know how to breathe normally anymore. Madison kept her eyes down, her hands clenched in the folds of her cream dress. Derek stood near the butcher's table with his shoulders rounded, all his careless amusement gone. Alpha Robert looked older than he had 10 minutes before, as if the truth had taken something from him he could not demand back. Alexander turned to him. "Every person in this kitchen will be treated with dignity from this morning forward." Alpha Robert bowed at once. Of course, Your Majesty. Not because I am here, Alexander said. Because they were always owed it. The correction was quiet, but it reached every corner of the room. Nora's face crumpled for a moment before she gathered herself, blinking fast as she turned toward the stove. Tommy stood taller beside the flour barrel, his bandaged hand held carefully against his chest, his eyes shining with the dangerous wonder of a child seeing fairness arrive late, but real. Emily looked at them, and for the first time, the kitchen did not feel like the place where she had been buried. It felt like the place where something had been uncovered. Alexander faced her again. Miss Carter, you do not have to answer anything today. You do not have to prove anything today. But there are healers in the Northern Court who understand gifts like yours. If you choose, you may come under my protection until you learn what has awakened. Protection. The word opened inside her with such force that she almost stepped back. Protection had always meant walls, locks, warnings, being hidden for the comfort of people with more power. But from him, it sounded different. Not a cage. A door. Emily looked toward Nora. The old cook gave the smallest nod, pride and sorrow tangled in her eyes. Tommy whispered, "You should go, Miss Emily." Madison made a broken little sound, but one look from Alexander silenced whatever she had hoped to say. Emily looked down at her hands. They were still her hands, pale, flour-marked, ordinary in shape. Hands that had scrubbed pans, wrapped burns, kneaded dough, carried trays, and touched small hurts no one else noticed. For years, Blackpine had called them useless because they had not held claws. Now she wondered whether the moon had given her something quieter because the world already had enough teeth. She lifted her eyes to Alexander. "If I go," she said carefully, "Nora and Tommy cannot be punished for telling the truth." A faint change crossed his face, almost a smile, though not quite. "They will not be punished." "And the kitchen staff?" Emily asked. "No one loses work because of me." "No one loses work because truth was spoken," he said. Alpha Robert bowed again, lower this time. "It will be as His Majesty commands." Emily heard the fear in his obedience, but she also heard the witnesses around him. Servants, guards, warriors, people who would remember. That was how change began, perhaps not as a roar, but as a room full of people hearing one clear sentence and knowing it could not be unheard. Alexander held out his hand, not demanding, only offering. Emily stared at it. Beyond the kitchen windows, morning had fully arrived, laying pale gold across the frost. She had begun this day as the girl everyone wanted hidden before breakfast. Now the Northern King waited in silence for her choice. Emily placed her hand in his. The warmth beneath her skin answered the cold steadiness of his touch, and somewhere deep inside her, the sleeping presence lifted its head once more. Not loud, not wild, gentle, strong, hers. As Alexander led her toward the open door, the servants stepped aside, but this time they did not move as if she were something shameful. They made a path. Emily crossed the threshold with flowers still on her sleeves and moonlight still in her palms, and behind her, in the kitchen where she had once been mocked, no one dared call her worthless again.